We were, I suppose, at our peak, bringing in about 4 million directly from church budgets themselves, which made us one of the larger church fundraising programs in the country, I expect. When I started in that role, and it was all quite daunting, one thing I was so struck by was just the generosity and open-handedness of the kind of Christian fundraiser community. I was really blown away by it at the time. I imagined there might be a kind of spirit of competitiveness and of keeping things secret, but it was the complete opposite. And actually, so many people who I reached out to for support, particularly in those early days, were incredibly generous with me and sharing their knowledge. Redina was one of those. I'm grateful to her and many others too. And so yeah, when Redina asked me to come and share a little bit today, I'm only too happy to do it. And that that kind of networking that Redina spoke of has been so important to me over the years. And yeah, hope events like this will be valuable for yourselves also. So I pitched this as kind of 10 top tips because I thought, well, that's quite catchy. And also there's probably some things I share that you'll know or you've heard before, but maybe if there's one or two little snippets just over the next 20 minutes or so that you can take away, then that's wonderful. And I'm sure as we get into maybe discussion and prayer afterwards, there might be some things that you can share that we can all learn from. And as Redina said, it's a big change for me now, going from big charity with big budget to now really little charity with, I think my fundraising budget for next year is £5,000. So learning to use resources a little bit different, which is all good fun. But anyway, off we go. I guess the first thing is church fundraising has been such a joy for me, and I've had some incredible experience and met wonderful people, been in some fabulous buildings, been into very odd churches as well, but that's been a great experience too, and made some amazing friends actually over the time. So I start from a position of just enthusiasm that actually doing church-based fundraising and getting around and visiting other churches has been a real honor and privilege and a joy for me over the years. So I hope you carry that same enthusiasm into this activity. But my top tip number one is develop a healthy spirituality of fundraising. And I guess as Christians, that starts with us, that starts with our heart, our understanding of and relationship with money, and understanding the kind of foundational principles of biblical fundraising. I think when we get that spirituality, maybe even that theology of fundraising down right, it releases us to approach people and approach this activity with confidence. It takes away some of the shame or some of the guilt or some of the fear or some of the worry that comes when we're fundraising as Christians from a slightly unhealthy place or from an unsure theology of fundraising. And so that covers a whole bunch of things. It's about asking the right way. It's having an attitude that really honors our donors. I think as well, it really helps internally to have a kind of corporate understanding of a bit of a spirituality or theology of fundraising, because often in Christian organization, I'm sure many of you have faced this, whilst maybe within your fundraising team there might be a real understanding of this, across the wider organization there can be a bit of skepticism, contempt, even disdain for the kind of work of fundraising. And I've encountered all sorts of things, whether that's organizations that have a kind of no asking policy. That may even be some of you present here today. I know that some still exists in some Christian organizations. That's not something I'd necessarily advocate. And other things that I encountered, such as the kind of idea of the widow's mite and how every church must be treated the same irrespective of their giving levels. That's quite a common kind of narrative that prevails. But I suppose as fundraisers, we know that if we spend £500 a year stewarding a church that's giving us £400, that's a really bad use of resources, whereas that church is giving us £10,000 a year, and that's probably quite a healthy use of resources. But actually getting some of our kind of theology and spirituality understanding down can really help just with some of those internal challenges or myths that you might have to bust a little bit. So I've just put up a few of my top 3 kind of reading, which really helped me in terms of developing my own theology and understanding. Spirituality of Fundraising by Henri Nouwen. That's a PDF. If you Google that, you'll get the PDF kind of free off the internet, I believe. And so that's a wonderful little read to have a look at. And then Keeping Faith in Fundraising is a really nice book. You'll be able to pick that up off whole bunch of online booksellers. And then this is a slightly niche one, but Funding the Family Business by Miles Wilson. That's more targeted at mission partners raising personal support, but it's got a few chapters at the beginning which are just absolute gold when it comes to this this kind of spirituality stuff and giving people a kind of confidence around asking. So I'd also recommend that one if you want to develop this. Top tip number 2, follow the full philanthropic cycle. Normally I'm sure this kind of 7-step process is familiar to many of you. If it's not, then have a Google of it and read and understand this, because this is a really critical thing for us as fundraisers. But this philanthropic cycle, we often are quite good at applying it when, for example, we're working with major donors, but sometimes we can get a bit lazy and we can take shortcuts when we're working with churches. We take unorthodox routes and we go in at different points in the journey, and that can just create some problems. So, for example, we might kind of go straight in with the cultivating or the asking without really having taken the time to research our churches or even identify who they might be, to kind of make a decent plan as to the propositions that we're going to bring forward. Sometimes we're actually really lousy at asking churches, particularly at the front of a church. When we're in a church, we feel uncomfortable about doing that, maybe for good reasons, but also not then figuring out how we have those conversations about asking. And we focus very much on relationship building without really moving to the ask. Or maybe we're confident enough to do an ask, but then we fail to close. And then there's problems with actually getting money that's been committed. And of course, sometimes it seems we can be quite poor at stewarding churches and understanding the unique way that churches need to be stewarded as well. So it's worth just going back over your notes on the 7 stages of the philanthropic cycle and then saying, okay, what does this look like for churches and what does it mean to actually follow through each of these in our church-based fundraising? Number 3, decide whether your churches are your gateways or your donors. I was trying to find some better language for this, but I couldn't think of anything. And so we'll go with that for now. But if anyone wants to suggest something better, what I mean by this is when we're approaching fundraising of churches, are we going with the mindset of we're really interested in securing financial gifts from the church corporate budget, or are we seeing this more as a gateway to solicit funds from individuals who are within the congregation? And this is really important to define quite early on, because it has a huge impact on kind of every stage of the journey that follows, because it might dictate whether you approach like big churches or small churches, because actually if you're interested principally in acquiring new individual donors through your church-based fundraising, you're going to want to approach churches with quite a lot of individuals in those churches. However, if you're interested in getting church gifts, well, actually that doesn't correlate as well, because sometimes what you find is big churches are quite stretched with their kind of mission budgets and all the rest of it. And you might find there's a tiny little URC church down the road, which has 4 members and meets once a quarter, but is sitting on an awful lot of cash that they can't seem to spend on anything. And so like that, it really does dictate the way you approach, who you might approach, how you might approach as well. Again, individual, if you're looking to recruit individual donors, then probably you need to be looking at Sunday services more. But actually, if you're after church gifts, often those negotiations or those discussions don't happen on a Sunday morning. They happen on Zoom calls with the minister or with a missions committee or pastor or church leadership team during the week or whatever else. And it also shapes your proposition, I guess, with individuals. You'd be looking at more appeal-based stuff, more call to actions, maybe value exchanges, maybe kind of data acquisition programs. More direct ask would be more appropriate for churches. And then your infrastructure you require as well. There's a huge amount of infrastructure, as you know, that's required to run an effective individual giving program with good stewardship and programs and retention programs and all the rest of it. Whereas actually with direct church-based fundraising, as a small charity, and speaking for myself, representing a very small charity at the moment, I know there's not a lot of infrastructure required in the same way on an accounting side as well with getting church-based gifts. So it's really important to think through. I mean, there's no right answer to this as to which one's which, but it's probably worth noting that some of the most successful church-based fundraising in the last decade has been going down more the gateway model. We're aware that churches are in decline, their own budgets are being squeezed. And what you notice is that when a church has a 5% drop in its income or a 10% drop in its income, it's very few places it can squeeze that. So, that might turn out to be a 50% drop in the missions budget, because 80% of its budget is on building and staff, and that's quite hard for it to cut, particularly at short notice. And so they make the cuts, unfortunately, very apologetically where they have to, and that can often be on their own charitable giving. So a really key thing to look at is when you're identifying churches, is looking at churches that are in decline versus churches that are growing, and recognizing that the churches that are in decline are actually going to be really hard to solicit for charitable gifts themselves, but they may still have a big audience to work with. The reality is as well that with the state of churches, but also the state of the congregation, we know that people sat on the pews in most churches. There's an incredibly wealthy generation actually that exists in most churches, and I would say in most congregations that I've kind of experienced, I would find one individual in that congregation which has a much higher level of charity giving than the entire church, the church budget itself. And really, you often find that there's a major donor, and particularly when you factor in legacy giving as well, there's some real success to be had in developing those relationships with individuals. Okay, number 4, we need to set realistic timelines for church giving programs. The lifetime value on church-based giving does tend to be really good actually, and that's because attrition is really low and the stewardship costs are quite modest as well. So you get good lifetime value generally out of your church giving programs, but the first year return on investment is often not that great. And the reason for that is because there's quite a high kind of relational investment up front, but also you just have this issue of quite long lead times. So classically, if you're trying to work with churches and things are going to the church councils or elders meetings or deacons meetings or whatever it might be, and these have month-long run-ins, and we know how these meetings go and things get bashed around and all the rest of it. So it can be your year 1 return on investment is quite low, and it's worth setting realistic timelines for your kind of key performance indicators. But it is worth it in the long run. The lifetime value is good. Okay, number 5, relationship over project. I was always amazed, and to be honest, a little bit alarmed at how little scrutiny churches give to project design, project impact, project effectiveness. It doesn't seem to be a great deal of understanding, and to be honest, not a great deal of interest in those questions that you might be used to answering for, say, your trusts and foundations or even your major donors. If you interrogate the average church mission giving, there's normally a story behind it, and that story tends to revolve around a relationship with an individual. And so when we're approaching churches, we do think relationship first, understanding that actually the quality of project is not as important as the person who pitches it to them. And that can be advantageous, because it means, as far as restricted funding is concerned, is you can save some of your more attractive projects, if you like, for some of your other funders, and then working with churches. That emphasis on project quality, as we might understand it through the lens of a trust or foundation, doesn't need to be as high for churches, and so you can pitch them other things. And what's really important is actually who's pitching it, who's the kind of relationship manager in that situation. Number 6, speakers are probably still your best tool. Some of the research that we did while I was at BMS showed that at both a quantitative research level and a qualitative research level, that speakers were the best tool in church giving. What I mean by that is to say that recency of a speaker at a church was probably the best kind of proxy indicator that we had of a church's giving level. And when we did our focus groups with churches and church leadership groups, the consistent thing that they wanted from us was a speaker to visit. It didn't matter necessarily whether that was staff, whether that was volunteers, whether that was mission partners. And that's hard really, because we know that speakers are time intensive. It's hard to deal at a mass market level, and you probably don't want to be traipsing across the country on a Sunday morning. Depending on the scale of your program, you just can't really do it for every church. But that was what the data kind of showed us when we were working with that. And it actually, me now in my new role, working in a very local context, I'm going to be prioritizing kind of getting myself into church on a Sunday morning as well, because I know that that will give me the best kind of return on investment. A few other kind of points about this, about the use of speakers. I think if you're doing speaking engagements, a few extra tips that I've found work really well. Sticking around for lunch has a massive impact, particularly if you can set that up in advance and say, hey, you know, I'm speaking on a Sunday morning, but why don't after the service, we just get a focus group of people who are interested, maybe the elders or whatever else, do a little Q&A, we can just carry on the conversation. That's a way that you really kind of win over and develop the relationship with some of the key stakeholders. Think about your kind of data acquisition in those circumstances, particularly if you're doing speaking engagements, but you're looking at church as a gateway to individual giving, then really you need to figure out a way that you're going to get the kind of personal data and consents of people within the congregation. There's some quite creative ways that you can do that. Could be like kind of little gift envelopes or sign-up cards or whatever else, or some kind of value exchange in that takes place in that service that allows you to get that data. It's good to have quite frank conversations in advance of the service about expectations, about financial giving. One funny story was I went to run an appeal for BMS in a church, and kind of showed the video and prepared a great service and did it all. And then the offering bag went round, and then the church said, right, we're going to be sharing this offering bag. 50% is going to go to Christian Aid and 50% to the local food bank. And I was just like, what? But I know, I mean, you know, I've encountered other kind of bizarre and similar things like that take place, but those can be mitigated if you have kind of honest expectations up front about kind of what's to be expected. And some of those as well, you know, conversations that I might have, you know, church might say, oh, can you speak on this passage? And the answer is honestly like no. Like if you love writing sermons, all power to you, but I think, you know, if we're doing this kind of thing regularly, actually it's one thing to commit a Sunday morning to go and speak in a church, probably another thing to be committing your Friday afternoon to writing a sermon. And actually, if you've got 2 or 3 sermons that you can just use over and over again and just kind of manage expectations with churches, it's perfectly fine for them to push back the sermon rota by a week to accommodate you. And then if you can, I find that videos make for really effective asks, and particularly where you're using other colleagues, staff, volunteers, mission partners, whatever it might be, to go into church and you expect them to deliver an ask. My experience is they'll normally either duck out of it or make a mess of it. And so if you can get a video and say, hey, you do this bit and all the relational stuff, and then when it comes to doing an ask, here's the video, you show this, that'll do the hard work for you. That can work really effectively. Oh, and final top tip, if you're struggling to get into churches, one of the things we found is that what we call interregnum, churches who are in between church leaders, pastors, whatever, is a great window where they're desperate for speakers. And sabbaticals as well. If you can figure out when church leaders are going on sabbatical, then you've got another great window. And they tend to kind of 3 to 6 months in advance is typically when the speaking rotas were assigned. So if you can get in ahead of that, then that's a good tip for getting into churches. Right, next up, know who your gatekeepers are and your insiders. So different churches will have wildly different approaches as to how budgetary decisions are made. And it's really important to know who the gatekeepers and who the decision makers are. And for some, particularly small churches, you find the church leader kind of makes most of the key decisions around the budget. But as a church gets larger, what I've noticed is that unless the senior leader is particularly interested in kind of local charity and mission, or they're just very hands-on and controlling in their management style, actually not unusual amongst church leaders, but generally the case is that decisions about charity support are one of the first things actually, as churches grow, church leaders just delegate out because it doesn't really affect them on a day-to-day level. It doesn't overly concern them, and it's quite an easy thing, particularly if you've got, you know, a congregation you need to appease on some issues, than actually just saying, hey, you take control of this bit. So larger churches, often your way in, your gatekeeper won't be through the senior leader or the the pastor if you're looking at charitable giving from the church budget. Often it might be through an associate pastor, associate leader, it might be through a missions committee. That's quite common in larger churches, that the budget for kind of charitable expenditure all gets delegated down to a missions committee. And so at that point, it's quite straightforward. You know, these missions committees might be meeting once a month or every other month for a prayer meeting, and actually reaching out to them, getting in touch and saying, can I join you for your prayer meeting, is quite an easy kind of route in for some of these groups. So do know who your gatekeepers are. And then your insiders as well. Who are the people on the inside who are going to champion your cause? And I'm sure you've got experience of this, individuals within certain supporting churches, and you just know that the reason that church continues to support and be so faithful is because you've got one absolute hero champion in there who's championing your cause. And so then thinking about, right, who are these people? How do we recruit them? How do we invest in them? How do we resource them to do their job? And that could be through like a formal advocates program or a less formal kind of relationship management system that you set up for those insiders. Number 8 is prospect research. So this goes back to the start a little bit, and that philanthropic cycle that we talked about, but really take the time to research at the start will give you better results. If you invest your time and potentially your travel and stuff going to a church that won't yield you good financial returns, that's just a really poor use of resource. So you do have to do your research. And when I'm researching churches, my main source of data, obviously their website's really useful, and that gives a good indicator about the type of church, and their social channels also quite helpful. Post-lockdown, YouTube's been fantastic because suddenly you can watch back their lockdown services and you kind of get an understanding of what the church is about. And if they're carried on live streaming post, then you also get a bit of a sense of the scale of the church. So that's really, really useful. But probably the biggest source of information when I'm doing prospect research on churches is their published accounts. So going on the Charity Commission website, searching up the charity number and pulling down their published accounts, because that tells you so much information you need to know about a church. It'll tell you how big their charity budget is and how they're spending it, which gives you an idea of what their values are, what they're committed to, but also like what their kind of big commitments are, because you'll discover that for some charities, it might be lots of like small local stuff, but there might be like personal connections you spot in there. And in particular, if a church, a medium-sized church or a small church has sent a mission partner overseas, then that's kind of their whole charity budget locked up for as long as that person's gone. And actually it's really difficult to compete with that because of the strength of the relationship. But also, if you're aware of a mission partner coming to retirement, then suddenly that becomes a great prospect because it opens up this whole chunk of finance from the church. Yeah, and accounts also give good indicators of membership and attendance, which is really useful data. Other stuff to look for is kind of who the gatekeeper is. You can find that out in your research, the kind of theological style, mission interests, how long the leadership has been in place. And all of that might lead you, depending on the scale of your church giving program, to think about, okay, how are we segmenting? And if we're doing a segmented church approach with different offers to different sizes of churches, or maybe different tribes of churches, denominations, I mean, you can split them up in a whole host of different ways. But if you're kind of segmenting your communication channels, then your research is going to be really important to that. Tip number 9, events are great entry points. So a couple of examples of what I mean by events. One is like topical events. So news stories, disasters, there are always these moments that capture public attention. And if you can be quick to respond with a resource, which you can get out to your supporting churches, and that creates a fantastic entry point. And even some rough and ready stuff is fine. I mean, we made the discovery far too late, but one of the things we discovered when I was working at BMS was that PowerPoint with prayer slides were just one of our most popular resources. And so, for example, when the conflict in Israel and Gaza began, that if we could be quick and just that within a few days or in that first week, just get a PowerPoint, with a few prayer points on out to churches, then the download rates were enormous on that, because that was kind of one less job for churches to do, and it was topical, it was relevant, and it just created a really good entry point. And similar with stuff like financial appeals around disasters and that sort of thing, if that's appropriate for the work you're doing. Then there's other events, whether it's Christmas or Easter or Pentecost, when the church might be doing something a little bit different, and you can provide a resource to support that. I used to work with a great church engagement colleague who was himself a church leader beforehand, and he always came at us with a mantra of, what's in it for me? That's the question the church leader is always going to ask, what's in it to me? And it helped me a little bit to think like a church leader who's running around trying to put a Sunday service together. And if someone drops a topical pre-written sermon or a prayer slide or a kid's talk or something into their inbox at the right time, then it answers that question, what's in it for me? You know, you've just saved me a load of time, a load of work, and that's brilliant. So that's a good mentality to have. So that's kind of that's one side of the events bit. And then the other thing is, like, can you pitch your own event? Because these do seem to work quite well, particularly for some of the larger charities who have the marketing budgets to do this. I'm thinking of, I know Open Doors have done some fantastic stuff over the years, kind of specific events that they've created and pitched to churches to, consider the persecuted church. I know Tier Fund has had huge success, I think, with the big quiz. That's been a real winner for them and has seemed to have a really good take up. At BMS, we always did quite well out of Harvest, but also had some success with like a Pentecost resource or even like a day of prayer thing over the years. These kind of events we found that churches did get behind. You need to be reasonably proactive with your marketing if you're going to make these work. We found really that telemarketing was the best way if you're pushing your own event, that actually if your emails and stuff weren't doing too much, once we got into the telemarketing, it was quite easy to persuade churches to run things. And don't forget that because you're principally dealing with business to business, you don't have the same GDPR restrictions in quite the same way when you're doing these, when you're doing things like telemarketing. So events are a great entry point. And then number 10, keep praying and keep going. Because I know it can just be really, my experience of being involved in this is that it just can be a really long slog. And sometimes it feels like you take a step forward and then you get a church phone you up and say, really sorry, we've had a church split over some issue and we've, had to slash all our budgets, and so we cut our funding, and you just get some really bad news. But actually, as I said at the start, lifetime value is really generally very good. It is a joy to be involved in, and even in spite of some of the setbacks and some of the headaches that inevitably come, just kind of keep sticking with it and keep praying as well. I always keep prayer right at the heart of my fundraising as a Christian, and God seems to consistently provide, which we're very grateful for. So those are my top 10 tips. I hope you took one or two useful things away from that. Back over to Redina.
Thank you, Ben. That was very useful, very interesting. I think at this stage I asked you if you want to put any questions on chat, or if you want to raise your hand and ask a question. I think we have a question from John Bell, who says, when you're prospecting a church and wanting to start building an introductory relationship with a gatekeeper, do you have any thoughts or preferences between in-person meetings or online meetings? What do you think, Ben? And anybody else who has already done this, please also feel free to share.
I would generally opt for online. I think post-COVID, that's just been an absolute lifeline. The ability to, it's the difference between half an hour of my time and a day of my time potentially. I find online is kind of 80% is good for about 5% of the cost and time.
Yes. Just following. Yes. You want to say something, Sophie? Okay. Another question from Prakash. Prakash is the representative of Global Trust Partners from Nepal. How can we guarantee transparency and accountability throughout the fundraising process with local churches? I think, I suppose from organizations like BMS, that you would have the transparency, accountability in place, because a gift would not be some money they give you and you put in your pocket. It's you just, they send a check, or if you receive a gift in cash, then it is reported to the finance office, I think, and that will be appropriately entered into the system. mean, do you have, you know, as organizations, probably not just BMS, but generally, is there like a document, like best practice in your organization to ensure transparency and accountability for gifts you receive from churches? Has anybody got any written documents or guidelines or best practices in place that you say we always abide by these guidelines?
Yeah, when I was, before I was with Tier Funds and I was with Innovista, which again is a small organisation, we would send out regular impact reports to churches to demonstrate the impact of their giving. Again, we were small, so we were able to, you know, we had good relationships with them. I don't work in that part of churches for Tier Fund, but that was, yeah, absolutely. I think there is a difference between trusts and foundations and major donors in terms of what they're looking for. But I think from our perspective, it was about knowing that we were being transparent about how we were sharing, what we were spending their money on.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, an important element in that cycle Ben was talking about, you know, how do you provide feedback to churches that give about projects, or, you know, how you spend their money, even if churches have asked, well, might be giving to you for 3 years, a certain amount every year, you know, do you actually report back, or do you think, well, these churches are giving, we don't have to say anything to them, they can receive our normal newsletters, but it might be worth adding in that comms cycle some specific impact reports that say your gift was allocated to this and this is how we spent it. I think Ruth is saying, Ben, you know, could you talk a bit more about the philanthropic cycle, please? Or maybe make some suggestion where they can read more, or she can read more.
Yes, I think the reason why I asked that, I wasn't sure what those elements were. I mean, in my mind, immediately I was thinking that as a charity or organisation, to be willing to be generous as well, but I wasn't sure whether that was necessarily part of it. So if you could just say a little bit more about what you meant, or the different elements of that philanthropic cycle, would be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll touch on it briefly. There'll be plenty of resources out there
Okay.
on the internet about this, and it comes from the major donor and fundraising work. But it's identify, research, plan, cultivate, ask, close, and steward. So identify is your starting point of kind of identifying different prospects, and then once you've got a prospect list, you start researching those prospects and understanding about them, learning about their interests, etc. Then you develop a little bit of a plan as to how you're going to approach them, and then you cultivate, which is the relationship building stage. So you're building the relationship, and once the relationship is sufficiently built, you're in a place to deliver an ask. So you make a proposition and an ask, and then once you've made the ask, you have to close, which is the bit that sometimes got forgotten, which is when people have agreed to give a gift, then actually making sure they do give a gift, and then stewarding that relationship thereafter. And it's called a cycle, because then it kind of loops back to the start. But there's loads of great stuff on there. And I just think it's a useful framework to overlay over the church giving to understand it.
I mean, what I learned from that, because we know that kind of you think, okay, major donors, but I find, at least in my work with ministries in building up their church fundraising, we have almost always started with, let's create a resource and let's send it to any churches we know. Actually, what Ben is suggesting is much more, I think would be much more effective in, okay, let's try and understand a little bit or find out a bit more, maybe about churches in your area, if it's a local ministry, or even the type of churches that already support you, that have been supporting you for years. You know, what research have you done on them? I think some of the comments Ben made about, you know, being the gateway, you know, is it a gateway versus a donor? Like, is the church the donor or a gateway to find donors? Is it a church with a minister in interregnum, so they don't have a minister? You know, is it a small, medium-sized church? Maybe even asking some conversations in that prospecting or getting to know you. You know, how do you spend your church's mission budget? What are your commitments for the next few years? So is this process of identify and research really happening before we say, well, let's do a poverty pack for churches and hope for the best, or let's do a Pentecost resource, or you know, and send it to any church we can think of. But actually, maybe those churches are not the ones who might support us. So we are targeting the right, you know, maybe the wrong churches. So thinking through those steps and working through those steps, I think would be really useful in how you invest your time and your money. I mean, Carol has talked here about experience. Does anybody here has experience in working with Black majority churches and building relationships with them? Carol is the sort of Black majority churches partnership fundraiser at Tier Fund. So, you know, is anybody kind of willing to share maybe of how you are engaging with Black churches and Black majority churches and some best practice? Ben, did you have at BMS, because obviously there are plenty of Black majority churches that are Baptist. Do you have anything to share from your time with BMS with this specific group of churches?
Yeah, so when I started early on, we had a staff member who was a person of colour. They were based in London with a specific brief around Black majority churches, and they were doing that for a long time with very, very limited success. And I think probably what we learned from that process is you know, any hint of kind of tokenism is just going to be dismissed very, very quickly. And, you know, step one is tackle and eliminate racism from your organizations. Because, you know, I remember chatting to a church leader from a Black majority church and said, and there was a friend, so we could have quite honest relationships. I'm like, explain to me the barriers. And they said, well, number one, you're in Oxfordshire. So, you know, once you've tackled racism in your organization, then leave Oxfordshire and then let's have another conversation. And so this need to have a real ownership. I think towards the end of my time, we'd had a couple of pilots with a bit more success, where very much the involvement was at project design stage. So this wasn't us, hey, here's some work we do, let's chat about it. The starting point was, hey, what is your church doing? Actually, what is your church doing in the world? What existing partners do you have in the world? How do we, kind of starting very much from where they're at, can we kind of collaborate and partner and work together on that project that you're already involved with overseas, and then create kind of collaborations emerging from that? It really was going all the way back to kind of project design stage. But it's absolutely vital, and so grateful that there's people like Carol pioneering this work, because what we've got is we're aware that by and large this is where the growth is, and this is where the future of the church is in the UK, and charities, particularly traditional white majority charities, can't be kind of left behind and naive to this.
Sophie, did you wanted to add something to the discussion? Sophie, Ben?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment, really. I think it is about relationships with the churches, and what exactly you're going in there to fundraise for would be an idea. Possibly talking to the leadership on a one-to-one basis, maybe getting into small groups. Maybe they may open a door for you to come and speak to a small group of people within the church to share what you're coming in there for, what you're fundraising for. It's just being clear about that. And I think it is about building relationships with somebody in the church as well that can champion what you are doing. And that's from, you know, experience.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Sophie. I think also Jill from IFES has put a really good comment here about many of our very limited but support from donations from Black majority churches are built on personal contacts and supporting student work in the countries their members come from, and which often their members have been involved as students. So looking for those stories of connection, maybe for some of you who are doing international projects, and building those bridges with you know, leaders or congregation members of Black majority churches and their countries of origin, or where you know, their sort of connections and are. So, and I think Julia has asked from SAT7, we are a really small team. How do you manage to develop and keep relationships with a growing number of churches? How often do you think it is good to be in touch beyond the first meeting? Yes, Ben, anybody wants to? We use email a lot and do at least like a monthly email to churches with a story and some feedback so that they are in the loop of what maybe some of our client organizations are doing, and also maybe involve churches in a couple of fundraising appeals annually, again, either via paper or email. But I'm sure there are more creative and interesting ways to do this. Any suggestions, Ben?
Oh, just that, you know, we really feel your pain. I mean, I think by the time I left BMS, we had a team of 4 people and 1,600 churches that we were trying to steward. So the ratios are crazy. You can't do it. So as I said, that the lifetime value tends to be quite good. The attrition tends to be quite low once they're on side. So your investment goes really in that cultivation and relationship building stage, and then really understanding, segmenting between what's our mass market offering, which really doesn't involve much personal human contact beyond a bit of telemarketing now and then. And I think telemarketing is probably going to be quite key. And then what's your kind of top 20% or whatever that's giving you 8% of the funding, where it's more hands-on relationship management. And you can't rely on just your existing kind of fundraising team or church team. That's going to have to reach out to, you know, CEO and trustees and others as well, and making sure that they're putting in a bit of a shift on this side.
Thank you.
That's interesting. I think Colin had asked a question that Liz Waldy has answered. If you don't already know any insiders in a church that can champion your work, how can you identify those people and get them on board? And Liz Waldy, who is the head of fundraising at Mission Without Borders, says, one idea that worked well for me in the previous organization was to look for people who send in an odd amount of money. It's probably a sign they have organized an event like a coffee morning, also for anyone who has asked for multiple copies of a resource magazine, etc., that they will distribute. So they could be really good leads. Wow, well done, Liz. You know, people who send this money saying, well, we did something, and people who are asking for multiple resources, maybe they are the people to begin, start and have conversations with about turning them into insiders in the church. Now we have some guests here from Europe as well. So I'm wondering if Jay is there. Are you there, Jay?
Yes, I am.
Yes.
Hello.
Hello. So Jay comes from Slovakia, and we have been working together for a ministry there called God's Own. So they are charismatic Catholics, and they do some amazing work amongst young people, but also have extensive kind of connections with churches and church networks in their country. And I would proudly say they raise most of the money, almost all of their money actually, in Slovakia for their work. And their annual budget is about 1.2 million euros. So maybe, Jay, if you wanted to share any insights on, you know, how you relate to churches, how does God's Own relate to churches, any things that maybe others can benefit from, or any ideas? Sorry for putting you on the spot, but
I will also turn my camera for this moment. I'm not sure if that what I want to share would be helpful, because the situation with churches is I would say a bit different than in the UK or maybe in the rest of the world. So the most funds that we've raised so far comes from like individual donors, and with churches the situation is like maybe more complicated in that regard. That like every church is kind of looking for for their own means how to finance their activities. So I think that specific part that is maybe specific to Slovakia or maybe the Eastern Europe in general is is really like determining of how is the cooperation in terms of fundraising going. But in terms of cooperation, besides fundraising, the cooperation is like very good. As Redina mentioned, we've been like, since the country is really small, so there is the absolute need to, you know, cooperate and to meet on a regular basis. So this is what is happening, and that's like very, very relationship based, as you mentioned a couple of times before, that this is like the relationships is the driving force behind like everything that is happening. And even if it's not like purely like financial cooperation, there's still a much of cooperation in regard of like speakers, you know, speaking at a different events or churches, or I don't know, worship bands that are connecting with one or another church are coming like to visit and to serve for a different church or different community. And this has been like very amazing to see in Slovakia, and like this is all thanks to relationship, I guess. So I'm not sure if that helps. I'm not sure if I can provide like any meaningful tips regarding like fundraising, but yes, relationships are like the core of how we work in Slovakia.
That's great. Thank you. Well, it helps, I mean, for us as well to think that churches are not just there to provide money and prayer, but also they are ministry partners. So for local based organizations or mission agencies is, you know, maybe an added question is how can we actually involve and work more closely with local churches to bring people from churches to help multiply the impact of our mission. So we don't then have to spend money to always employ or get, you know, get outsiders to do the work. So it can be a, you know, I think quite useful as well. Yeah, nice to see. Yes, yeah. Anything anybody else wants to add? Any ideas, perspectives, questions? Then maybe we can spend a bit of, you know, close the meeting with a prayer. And if you want to add in the chat, I will, you know, I'll send the recording to all of you, as I said, and Ben's PowerPoint, so you can have those slides and to jog your memory as well. But if you want to write down like what would be some other topics you want to have people contribute to the discussion, just kind of write the topics and then I'll copy and paste and think of, you know, who we can invite to contribute. And also feel free to put yourself forward as well and say, I've got a story to share, or this is an area where our organization is really doing well, and we want to share your knowledge, your expertise, your insights with others, because as I said, this is about us learning from each other. So yes, yeah, the books will be in the slides, Prakash, so you can have access of the titles of the books. Yeah, that's fine. So yeah. Okay, so does anybody volunteer to close the meeting in prayer? Or shall I call out somebody? Yes, Ruth. Can you
I'm
unmute?
happy to
Yes.
do that. Yes, I'm
Yeah,
happy to close
great.
in prayer.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Heavenly Father, I want to thank you that you have been here with us as Ben and Redina have shared and as others has contributed. And thank you that, you know, as Redina shared, that the church is your body, and that you call us all into this very important part of service, which is mission. And I just ask, Lord, that you will continue to be with us and guide each organisation represented here in terms of building those really important relationships with your church. And just ask that you will provide and meet all their needs. Thank you for this opportunity of being together and sharing. And just ask that you just keep your hand on all that we do, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ruth. And thank you, Ben, for your contribution. That's wonderful. Lots of food for thought, and to everybody who was able to make it. And I'll send an email around with the link to the recordings, and, you know, feel free to put questions forward and suggestions for future meetups. And hopefully we will meet again in April after Easter, so you can get on with your Easter appeals and campaigns. And yeah, all the best. It's wonderful to see so many of you here, new and old friends.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Bye. Right. Thank you, Ben. That was inspiring, even for me, even for the good old me.
I'm glad you liked it.
Loved it.
Right,
But yeah, it's nice because I think in a lot of organizations, we also kind of do the, I'll stop recording here.